All right, well, let's get going. Please interrupt me or Slack at me if something goes awry with the technology. My name is Chris Morris. I've been developing software for over 20 years. I'm currently the director of engineering at Mystery Science. And before that, I spent 6 years at Living Social slash Groupon. And technically, I'm still a core team member of Bundler, but I haven't contributed there in quite a while. So it's generous of them to keep my face up on the website. This is a new talk. I appreciate you all letting me try it out here. I'd love your feedback on it. It's mostly tech agnostic, but as I've been a diehard Rubyist forever, Ruby will get a little bias. So before we get going, some shout outs. I always like to promote this book, The Healthy Programmer, published by Prague Prog. It's got some great practical advice for those of us who make a living the way we do. In short, read this book so you don't die in your chair. And a hat tip to my friend Sarah Fleming for the GIF. The OSMI support forums evolved out of a site called DevPress, started by Greg Boggs. They can be a great place to get some support for yourself or someone you know who struggles with mental issues. And finally, a shout out to the classic Pragmatic Programmer book, since a lot of the stuff in my talk is inspired by or just flat out ripped off from it. So if you don't know, the 10x developer is a developer who is an order of magnitude more productive than an average developer, although its existence has sparked many debates over the years. The idea of a 10x developer can at least be traced back to a couple books by Steve McConnell in the 90s, his book Rapid Development, and his first edition of his book Code Complete, which in turn cite earlier studies going back to, I think, the 60s. And the quality of those studies are easily called into question. For a counterpoint view on 10x and a lot of other topics like that, one resource you can check out is The Leprechauns of Software Engineering, which arose specifically from a blog post critiquing Steve McConnell's writings on the 10x developer. So 10x, 5x, 2x, it may be a myth, but if they do exist, in my opinion, they subsist on small habits that buy themselves productivity over the long haul versus, folks who can just type 10 times as fast as you. Most experienced developers understand that quality engineering involves trade-offs, whether it's security versus convenience, code that reads well versus performs well, and short-term versus long-term productivity. This XKCD comics, one of my favorite, captures that tension. So every day we have to make these little decisions between manual or automated salt, and we'll mess up many of these choices, but if we're consistently weighing out both the short and long term, we can experience multiplicative benefits of solid tooling. The road to hell is paved with short-sighted compromise, but balancing out our needs can lead to hellacious productivity. We know that being impatient can make a bit of a mess, but sometimes we still got to get stuff out the door quickly. In those cases, just be sure to negotiate for time to clean up your mess afterwards. So I'm going to talk a little bit about testing. Software development may be an unusual field in how we segregate this notion of testing from coding, when, from my point of view, testing and coding are really just two sides of the same coin. Directors will storyboard their movies so they can cheaply review the screenplay. Musicians will repeatedly practice their performances, listen back to recordings of their practice sessions. Artists will do studies, a drawing, sketch, or painting in preparation for a finished piece. Writers have editors, etc. It's all part of an essential feedback loop. Last week, David Brady tweeted this. Said, do you really think testing is good? Starting to feel like we think testing sucks. Is it good or just an accepted evil? And a lot of the conversation was around the eventual payoff of these tests down the road. And I replied that tests are valuable to me immediately because they help me think about or even shape the design of my production code, and it has a built-in rubber duck effect. Now, David's tweet isn't surprising to me, not just because I see it in others who may not understand how great it is that we can take it for granted these days, but because I still see this in myself. Sometimes, in the name of productivity, it can be tempting to skimp on testing. But the sooner we can understand what we're building, the sooner we can catch misunderstandings, the cheaper it is, and therefore the more productive we are. And we can't do that without many of the feedback tools we use, testing being a powerful one. So one benefit, long-term flexibility is an important attribute of our code for long-term productivity. And so one of the most prevalent productivity killers in software is tight coupling. So when we're writing a new piece of production code, it's almost always in service of an existing piece of production code. And without any intervention, there's no immediate penalty for tightly coupling two pieces together. A unit test acts as a second client of the new piece of code. And since it has no interest in the dependent production code, it can penalize you for tight coupling and encourage a better design if you listen to it. This is one of the reasons I believe mocking can be a code smell. Sometimes we will mock to mask the pain of tightly coupled production code. Sometimes this is intentional when working with legacy code to just help us get out of a tight spot, but that's more of an exception to the rule. The feedback from testing during coding also helps me think through use cases, particularly edge cases. Without tests, I'm more tempted to stay focused on just the happy path and cut corners on robustness. In addition to feedback during development of new code, rerunning our tests can protect previously developed code. Checklists have shown themselves to be a powerful tool in the fields of aviation and medicine to avoid mental errors and make sure things are working before we thumb our noses at gravity or cut into a patient. Our test suites are like a huge automated pre-deploy checklist. I did just say the word huge, and this transitions us to one of the common problems with test suites. They just run so dang slow and get slower with every test we add. So it's great that we want quick feedback, but don't let that lead you into being obsessed with the speediness of your test suite. First, remember that one alternative to your slow automated test suite is a separate QA department that's under-resourced on time and people, and you have to wait like 3.5 weeks to get shrug percent coverage. I worked at many companies who operate this way, and there are still many, many places out there like it. So first off, just something to keep in mind while waiting for your CI build to finish. Another danger of speed obsession is over-mocking. This is a contrived example from a ThoughtWorks article called "Mockists Are Dead, Long Live Classicists." Try saying that one time slow. In this contrived example, you can see how tests can pass when they shouldn't, and pursuing too many mocks in the name of speed can deteriorate the quality of your tests. But we don't just have to check our expectations for test speed. There are some things we can do to help. One practical option is to lean on your CI. The bundler test suite is not only large and slow, but some of the tests are specific to certain platforms. Getting the whole thing to run locally on your development machine can be difficult. So in cases like this, I usually will only run the tests I need to locally and rely on CI to cover the whole thing. My usual pattern is to use RubyMine to run the specific test my cursor is on. Then as things are passing, run the current file, then use a shell script like this one to help get a wider run of feedback from several files. Then I can commit those to a branch and let CI tell me how things are going across the board. And by building out shell scripts like this, that you can focus the tests more likely on things that are going to give you the most valuable feedback. And by saving these and curating these scripts, you can also discover some interesting boundaries of the code base that come in handy when you want to try and break it up into libraries or services. Some other quick comments on ways to try and increase your speed. You can sometimes skimp on unit tests in favor of integration tests, especially if the unit tests are model tests or things that are going to hit the database. Share some of your database fixtures. Just do a one-time setup, run a whole bunch of tests, and then clean up those database fixtures afterwards. Build out a plain old object suite. If you work in Rails, for example, loading its environment takes a lot of time. If you're building out plain old Ruby objects, you can have a test helper or spec helper that bypasses the framework when you don't need it. Of course, there are tools like Spring and whatnot that'll keep the whole Rails process loaded to save you some time that way as well. And then these days, you've got good options for running your tests in parallel. Both Travis CI and Circle CI, at least I know, offer options there. And then, as mentioned a couple slides ago, a larger decision you can make to reduce your test suite expense is to move code out into libraries or separate services that can run their own tests. Keep in mind, of course, introducing boundaries like this come with costs, both in terms of infrastructure and integration testing. There are a few different uses for a staging environment. Some engineers I worked with want a staging environment to be as close to production as possible to help with higher level testing and catch those hard to find in dev problems. In my opinion, this can be pretty expensive, and with the plethora of A/B testing approaches and feature flag techniques, personally, I think a staging environment that aims to be just like production can be a big time suck and not worth it. I believe you're better off figuring out how to test safely in production. There can always be subtle differences in two environments, and if it passes in staging but still fails in production, that hasn't necessarily paid for itself. Some of you may work at very large organizations where you have the resources to be able to make that happen, and if so, awesome. All right, enough about testing. So getting a little broader here. So if you work in an object-oriented language, know your object-oriented principles. Learn the SOLID principles. SOLID is an acronym if you're unfamiliar with that. Check out anything Sandy Metz has done. It's Ruby flavored, but usually applicable to any object-oriented language. When your tests are giving you feedback about design pain, as we talked about earlier, you need to know what your options are. and also have a decent working knowledge of refactoring patterns. One in particular I wish most object-oriented devs knew about is the replace conditional with polymorphism refactoring. That's usually a telltale sign that there's an option to introduce more objects into the design. Delete old code. It is a time waster. It clogs your editor, gets included in grep results. You can waste time doing analysis on stuff that's not even used anymore, not to mention wasting time running tests over code that's out of action. And production code coverage tools are a thing. A couple of them I'm at least aware of. Dan Mayer, a former colleague of mine at Living Social, made this tool called Coverband, which I think uses SimpleCov to check things out in production. Michael Feathers also has a tool he wrote called Scythe. Be interested in hearing more about that if anyone's got any recommendations there. Write good commit messages. Not just commit messages, but code comments when appropriate, class names, methods. Keep the README up to date. Pay attention to all those things. Also pay attention to the distance between the code and where the documentation resides. Sometimes we fall into habits of documenting something in a distant system, in a wiki or some other thing that's over here, when it could just as easily be committed to the code base and stay closer to the code that it pertains to. If you need separate docs, if you've got an API that's public that you need to publish those things, obviously you want to look for ways you can automate those docs so that the source content of your docs stays close to the source code. Keep your throwaway code. This is one habit I don't see often enough and maybe controversial. I try to keep and commit most of the code I use when I'm troubleshooting something or doing routine tasks. So like at Living Social, our ops folks were really good about keeping console history so that when someone had left, we could see all of the various things they did, which is great, except that if I'm taking the time to write it in the first place, I could stash it somewhere. I could actually commit it. You won't come back to all of it. You may not even come back to most of it, but the stuff I do come back to, I can refine, I can iterate, and some of that will eventually make it into the production code base. And as much as we love automation as developers, it's amazing to myself, even for myself, how often I'll get caught in the cesspool of manual labor. I just get in the habit of doing things manually. And one reason why it can be invaluable to rotate team members into a part of a code base or work routine is so that they can notice these stale, wasteful habits that will accrue, and they can help point us to ways that we can make our lives more productive instead of just doing the same old thing we're used to. This next one is important for myself. I tend to be introverted and stubborn. Talk to other human beings. If you don't have any human beings at the ready, use the rubber duck technique. In particular, I like the rubber duck in Slack, though I need to do that in a room that's not going to interrupt folks. Or especially, I'll do it in my card or ticket system if I'm working on something. It's an excellent way for me to process and also capture progress when I'm working on something that's kind of nasty. Also be a good way to update my stakeholders at the same time for free. Go outside, take a walk, talk out loud like a crazy person, anything to help get unstuck by engaging different parts of your brain. And pairing. Some of you may work in companies that do pairing a lot. Pairing can yield a lot of interesting insights into how others do things and give you tips. There are so many tools that we use, so many abstraction layers we're working on top of. There's no possible way we can know all of that. So it's good to learn from other people. Anyway, so we've drawn no conclusions today on the existence of the elusive 10x developer, but hopefully I've given you some inspiration for hauling in the big fish of productivity. And besides, none of this matters anyway, because Google did that study a few years ago showing that psychological safety on a team is the most important factor for productivity. So if you want to know more about that, I blogged about it like 2 years ago, and it's still on the front page of my website, clabs.org, so you can check that out there. So that's my talk. Thank you again for the time. Another shout out for my employer, Mystery Science. We are a really cool small company. We make online science lessons for elementary schools. It encourages kids to experiment, be curious, and learn the scientific process hands-on. You can check us out at mysteryscience.com. If you're looking for a gig, hit me up and let's talk. Otherwise, that's me on Twitter and the web. Thanks.
Does anyone have any questions for Chris? Unmute yourself, I suppose, and ask away. Anyone learned?
Ask away. Surely I said something ridiculous.
I don't have a question, but a comment. Thanks for that book recommendation. I've just bought it on Audible, The Healthy Programmer.
I'm going to buy as well.
Question about like your throwaway code. You say you store it. Do you have like a way to store it and index it so you can actually like find something again when you think you have written something before that will be useful?
Not really. I mean, usually it's just in the code base itself. I try to put it in a separate, well, like in Rails, it's still got that scripts folder that I don't know if anyone uses it for. So I'll throw things there. If not, I'll just make a folder in the code base that kind of, and even put a README in there just for other devs and say, hey, this is just some, I had to go fix so-and-so and I use these 2 lines of code at the console, but it felt like the kind of thing we'll probably come back to. So we should probably make this a rake task, for example, or something like that. So just trying to mark it up and make sure it is organized somewhere because, the point I made about deleting old code and it coming up in grep results, it's like, I don't necessarily want that stuff to come up in grep results if it's derails somebody, except that even then that actually could come in could come in handy in terms of, oh, I didn't know that we're doing this thing every 3 weeks to help get this job through the queue that always gets stuck every once in a while. So no real recommendations there. I think in Slack y'all were talking about some of the code indexing servers, which I would love to learn more about.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea that feels like it's kind of calling out for a real pattern of understanding how to, like within an organization, to understanding how to wrap your head around experimental code that exists, but at least in our org, like we never commit that stuff, but it could be really useful too.
I've just worked with too many engineers who like rolled off or whatever, and then as they leave, oh yeah, I've got all these scripts on my hard drive you may want to use because I'm the only person who knows how to do such and such. And it's like, you're a software developer. Commit those, version control those. That's really valuable stuff.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, Chris.